something highly, highly recommended. So check that out. That'll be in November. So on that note, I would like to introduce you officially to Brandon. Brandon is a visionary in the field of spontaneously fermented beer. It's all barrel-aged beers. And the connection with Brandon and I, we were connected through the grain chain, actually. And the Antero wheat we use in one of our key whiskeys, and it's also a foundation for what they do here at Primitive Beer. So with that really lousy introduction, Brandon, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
No, I think that was a great introduction, and thank you. I don't know about visionary, seems extreme, but yeah, I'm Brandon. It's a pleasure to meet everyone out there. Welcome to Primitive Beer. We are a brewery that is extremely niche and specified. We are essentially trying to brew Belgian lambic outside of the proper geographic appellation. So much like Champagne has the area in France where outside of which it cannot be called Champagne, despite your adherence to process, we are strictly following a set of parameters, a set of rules to create a spontaneously inoculated beverage that if it was in the Pajottenland or the Seine River Valley of Belgium would be called lambic and blended in a way that makes another beverage called gueuze. But as a result of being lowly Coloradans, we are creating method traditional spontaneous beer. And this is a beverage that is, we think about wine having terroir, or this sense of earth, the sense of time and place. In that case, it's about the soil and the climate to which grows the grapes. For us, we are creating beer that is all about terroir spoken to through airborne microbes and the inoculation in a vessel called a cool ship, which we'll show you soon. But I think fundamentally, and part of our ethos is using only Colorado ingredients. So part of our terroir is hugely related to the grain, the water, as well as locally grown hops, as well as any other ingredients from Colorado that we source as part of a re-fermentation down the line. In terms of how our beer is made, we'll go into that in a second, but 40% of the makeup from the grist is Antero wheat and in its raw form, and the other 60% is Genie barley, also grown in Colorado and malted. Besides cool ship inoculation, airborne microbes, we're talking about how the grain influences and selectively pressures that kind of randomness, that microbial action in the air to produce something over the course of 1 to 3 years that makes a beverage that we are excited to drink, to share, and potentially age gracefully. So that's pretty much the
Exactly. Aging gracefully is always a good thing.
Yeah, both as people and as the spirits that you produce. But that's I'd say the shtick of what Primitive is. It's 100% Colorado ingredients. It's making a very esoteric and old world style of beer. And it's about trying to do something that many people think is a fool's errand, maybe in both cases.
Well, and Brandon, what I'd like to do is just kind of give a really kind of a pan virtual tour of the brewery here.
Yeah, please.
So we're going to try this, and we're going to try to keep everything, Brandon, in screen. So let's. I'm going to have Brandon. I'm going to have you.
Yeah. Was it easier to use the phone, or do you want to use?
Let's use this. I think we're okay.
Let's go. We're walking. We're walking. All right, so yeah, hopefully the humming of the HVAC isn't too loud. So this vessel in front of us is called the Cool Ship. It is what I would consider a Flemish vessel, or spelled Koelschip. What we mean by Cool Ship is an area where hot wort that is still at boiling temperature, the sugar water that is created from the mash of the raw wheat and the malted barley, is emptied in here and allowed to cool overnight between 12 and 18 hours, typically in the winter months when the space can be cooled down to the appropriate temperatures. And during that cooling period is when any of the airborne microbes are able to inoculate. For fermentation to occur, it is all about the right cooling rate, the windows open, the outside air and inoculants to come in, as well as potentially many of the microbes that are now housed in the space over time. we're looking to create this type of microbial equilibrium so that despite it being spontaneous and somewhat random every time and every batch, there is some degree of consistency between what type of microbes are actually able to inoculate this wort and give us a favorable product. So our hot side, basically the mash tun, water tun, brew house, etc., that is offsite. We travel to different breweries and produce our worts through the graciousness of friends. We have a tanker truck where we then will take that hot wort still at boiling temperature, drive it up to our facility, empty it into this cool ship, and that is the first stage of kind of beer production at Primitive Beer. So the next morning, it comes out of this cool ship, now at about 68 degrees instead of 205 degrees. And we will put it back into the tanker truck to homogenize it, make sure the microbes that have landed on the surface, as well as that stratified depth of that wort, or now beer, are represented in the whole of the substrate. And then it will go into these neutral barrels. Whatever's easiest. These neutral puncheons for fermentation and maturation over the course of typically 1 to 3 years, sometimes a little bit longer. All of these puncheons, we have 54 of them, were sourced from a Barolo producer in Italy. Unfortunately, there were no Colorado wineries that were getting rid of their large format vessels, their puncheons. So once this winery had extracted all of the tannic and oak qualities they were looking for that type of Italian red wine, they had no further use for it, and they found brewers that were interested in the use of oak, both for housing microbes as well as breathability of oxygen at a really nice, slow seasonal progression. So oak is another ingredient in the way that our beer is made, as is, I guess, thyme in that way too. Besides these puncheons, we also have some larger foeders over here. The whole idea behind using some of these larger format vessels instead of smaller wine barrels or bourbon barrels has to do with surface area to volume ratios, oxygen, and that exposure to oak for the specific parcel of beer. If you think about a bubble, the smaller the bubble, the greater the ratio of that surface area to the volume. So as you get a larger bubble, or in this case, a larger barrel, per unit volume, less of the surface area, less of that oak or that oxygen is actually coming into contact with that beer, and it has the potential to age a little bit more gracefully. Oxygen at the right level helps fuel microbial action. At the wrong level, it starts to produce vinegar, ethyl acetate, or acetone, and a range of other compounds that aren't, bad or good, but less desirable for what we're trying to make. So
now, how big in gallons are these?
So these puncheons are 500 liters or about 130 gallons a piece.
The big guys?
Whereas these guys are between 10 hectoliters, 13 hectoliters. So we'll call it between 300 and 350 gallons a piece. In terms of the size of a standard, we'll say a 53 gallon or 200 liter bourbon barrel, or 59 gallon or 225 liter wine barrel. These are twice or greater in terms of volume. And there are certainly foeders that range, or other barrels that range much larger. I think the largest foeder in the world was created by the same architect that made the Eiffel Tower. I think it's called the Eiffel foeder, and it's still housed somewhere in France. And it looks almost kind of like a small skyscraper. It's pretty ridiculous, but basically the same people who were designing, and this is a weird tangent from Brain, but the same people who were designing foeders were also designing warships and large wooden vessels back then. You can keep liquid in a barrel, you can keep liquid out of
cool.
flooding a ship. So,
yeah.
I guess oak is grown, so it is part of the land and part of the terroir. But we'll definitely be focusing a little bit more on the use of grain and how that influences our process.
Yeah. So the next stop, I know that you have such a connection with Troubadour up in Fort Collins.
Yeah.
Yep. Troubadour Maltings, and Mark Arnish Farms, where it grows the Antero. Can you talk just a little bit about the story and how you were connected to the grain chain? Through the Antero.
Absolutely. It's a story of a friendship and people meeting people, and how an ingredient can tie people together. So originally I started as a brewer earlier on in my career at this Odd 13 Brewing in Lafayette, and I was the head brewer at the taproom location. And that was, especially as that brewery grew and we opened a production facility, the taproom housed more experimental beers and much smaller batch kind of creations. And I must have met Chris and Steve early on, probably in 2014, 2015, at which point I was trying to procure more local ingredients to do 100% Colorado beers, and may have been a right place, right time, but they started to taste me on a bunch of the malts that they were creating. And I was thoroughly impressed with both the grains that were being grown in Colorado, as well as their expertise in terms of malting and their vision for what that looked like. At the same time, Lisa, my wife and the co-owner of Primitive Beer, and I were considering opening our own Fool's Errand, or our own kind of brewery up at that point, and figuring out what that looked like and what the ethos was. And very early on, we knew that it was going to be something that housed 100% Colorado ingredients, and was focused on supporting local businesses and local farmers. And as we talked more and more, the specificity of that project got even narrower and narrower until it was only wild beers, and then spontaneous beers, and then spontaneous beers of this one very specific tradition. And as we were going through all of that, we kept in contact with Chris and Steve and Troubadour, and figured out that this was a partnership that made a lot of sense in terms of not only supporting them, but then supporting the Amish farms and some of the other local farmers on the Front Range and the plains of Colorado, and trying to exhibit terroir, not just through the airborne microbes, but also, as I mentioned before, some of those other ingredients, the grain being a huge part of that. And then fast forward a little bit, I met Nels through Chris and Steve, and over that love of specifically Antero, you making that 100% Antero whiskey, and us having 40% of every single beer that fills every one of these barrels filled with Antero in the raw wheat form, not the malted wheat form. So a friendship started there, and I think you invited me to a Grain Chain event at Moxie. So I forget the author's name, but it was a fantastic talk about the book that he was writing or had already published. Meet the author, talk about heirloom grains, and maybe some of the ambiguity between people who have gluten sensitivities that may not be related to gluten, but also specifically some of the pesticides and some of the other components used for grain growth that are affecting people's systems. And the whole talk was extremely fascinating. But and big shout out to Moxie, favorite baker in Colorado.
They rule.
Yeah,
yes.
That's amazing. So if that gets me free croissants, all about it. But shameless plug there. But getting to meet a range of other passionate individuals, growers, producers, makers, enthusiasts has been absolutely one of the best parts of forming our own passion project. So
Well, I know we want to talk a little bit about the Antero specifically in the grain, but I thought we could also walk through and over to the bar and take a look at some of your packaging, because it's pretty unique what you guys do.
Totally. I can even open a beer if you want to.
It's almost
early,
noon. So we're doing another cruise through. I'm going to pan a little bit just so you can kind of get a sense of the space as we go. The Primitive Beer is a really, really lovely, useful space that not only has all the production, but it also has a great place for community gatherings. So Brandon and Lisa have done a phenomenal job of designing a very inviting, yet very production-oriented space, which is a pretty difficult thing to pull off sometimes.
Well, that's very kind of you. I appreciate that. And we're very excited to once again be fortunate in the position to have people back into our space. Starting in October. We've been closed since March 2020. I guess I'll shamelessly plug myself now. And at this point, we are gearing up to be back open, have people on site. We have a vaccination requirement, but by virtue of all of the employees, just Lisa and myself, and requirement for vendors and customers to have a proof of vaccination, at least right now, the indoor mask policy, we have an exemption from it, which creates a nice, safe, and comfortable space to be able to enjoy weird, spontaneous local beer. So that's yeah, something we're very excited about. So here's an example of some of our packaging. So that we are, for the most part, when our beer gets old enough to bottle condition, so basically past the 2-year mark, we blend it. We either use young spontaneous beer or local honey from B Squared apiaries in Loveland, and we allow that addition of that new sugar with the complex blend of mature beer, once packaged in the bottle, to re-ferment and create that carbonation, much in some ways like Methode Champenois, over the course of another typically 4 months to a year. And after that, given the complex microbial assemblage that is still in the bottle without any form of pasteurization or fining or filtering, those microbes can scrub any oxygen that gets into that package over many years and create a product that can, if we're looking at Belgian contemporaries, age for an additional 20 to 25 years. So kind of looking at our beer aging like a fine wine in some degree or fashion. One of the main focal points of the flavor profiles in our beer would be some degree of funk, bitterness, and acidity. So finding 2 out of 3 of those components that are not found in typical modern beers. Bitterness is typically structuring when you think of IPA or German style lagers, etc. For us, a lot of that lactic acid bacteria in the right amounts are creating this pleasant acidity. Brettanomyces, a type of wild yeast that is a little more fastidious, takes about 6 months to even show up in our beer, but over then the next 1 to 25 years is what's going to take the bulk of fermentation as well as maturation, and that's what's going to create these really interesting, what we consider funky flavors. So in some ways, when we describe the flavors of our beer, it's almost more like listening to someone describe the flavors of a washed rind cheese or something like that. You'll hear barnyard and straw and diesel and a lot of sweaty gym socks, flavors that you might not necessarily think, oh, is that something that they want in their beer? But again, everything in the right magnitude can be beautiful. So for us, a big component of this is blending and making sure that, it's rare that we have a single barrel that exudes every quality that we want. So in many cases, we're taking multiple barrels at the right volumes and getting what we hope is the balance that we're looking for in a beer.
Can we talk a little bit about, I know you mentioned you're using obviously Antero.
Yes.
But maybe talk a bit about, the mash bill, the grain basis, and why you chose to use those 2 grains.
Totally. Primarily, first of all, tradition. So in order to be, lambic inspired or method traditional, there's a very well-defined range that you can use of either of those, just those 2 ingredients. It's looking at somewhere between 30 to 50% raw or unmalted wheat, and then 50 to 70% of a Pilsner equivalent, or basically low kilned barley. So we already knew what we were looking for from a colorimetric as well as kind of brew house efficiency standpoint from our grains, from our raw and our malted grains. Then it was, that while that seems very well regulated, as we know from just what type of grains you're using, where they're grown, some degree of creativity in the malt house, that allows a lot of room for experimentation, a lot of room to still, set yourself apart, not to mention how time and the spontaneous microbes amplify the effect of those early decisions. What we're primarily looking for, especially out of the raw wheat and how we mash our beer, is to create a complex assemblage of polysaccharides and protein-rich wort. Typically, when you think about the type of wort you're looking to create for beer fermentation, when you talk to an IPA producer or most lager producers or 99.9% of brewers, you're looking for a highly fermentable wort such that when you add yeast to that wort post boiling, that yeast is able to completely ferment that sugar and create the alcohol and CO2. That is because you know exactly what yeast you're adding to it, and you want that yeast to have a vibrant fermentation and create a product that is drinkable in a relatively short amount of time. Because we are relying on this complex assemblage, and we'll call it unpredictable assemblage of spontaneous microbes, it's important that the range of sugars gravitates more complexly so that those early microbes aren't able to devour the entirety of those sugars or of that wort. I like to look at the way that microbes inoculate and progress through our work very similarly on the microbiological level as maybe landscape ecologists look at how there are different plants growing on a landscape that is just decimated by a wildfire. So if you think about a parcel of land, we'll say it's a fire, but it could be anything that basically eliminates the living world, the flora, and creates a dirt patch. You think of the grasses are the first things that grow. They can grow quickly, and that's their advantage. Everything's competing for sunlight. After the grasses, you get slightly slower moving shrubs. All of a sudden, those shrubs are able to grow taller and wider. They're able to outcompete the grass for the light. Then you might have some conifers. They're coming up. They are now creating too much shade in the understory for some of those grasses and shrubs to keep competing for the light. And then over time, you might have some of those deciduous larger trees that can now even outcompete the aspens. And while they are the slowest to grow, they are able to also find some of the more difficult to obtain resources to be able to actually get to those heights and finally create, maybe what you would consider the keystone or that final succession of that landscape. For us, it's somewhat similar in that the first microbes that start to inoculate this barren wort, this sterilized parcel of sugar, and instead of competing for sunlight, they're competing for nutrients and those saccharides. But those first microbes that are starting to inoculate or starting to be able to grow exponentially tend to be some lactic acid bacteria, some of the wild yeasts like Cloacara and Pichia, and Enterobacter, some of the same types of microbes that we'd find in our gut. So when you think about gut flavors, those are not super desirable. Those are able to start fermenting between 3 days and 3 weeks after inoculation. They are able to consume, because of the way that we mash, a very finite amount of sugar, and they also produce some acid and a little bit of alcohol that basically prohibits their further growth. At about the 1 month mark to 3 month mark, for another 3 months, it's wild Saccharomyces that starts to then do the bulk of alcoholic fermentation. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the standard brewer's yeast that we've collected and trained over time. That's what most people are pitching. We're relying on the airborne version of Saccharomyces to be able to do a lot of that alcoholic fermentation. But Saccharomyces itself, even though it's able to grow a little bit quicker and consume a broader assemblage of sugars, still is relatively sensitive to highly alcoholic environments and somewhat sensitive just to nutrient availability. So it goes dormant probably at about the 3 month mark. At about the 6 month mark, finally, over a long amount of time, Brettanomyces, a wild yeast and a type of microbe that most brewers are super fearful of, we are actually waiting for inoculation in our barrels, and it takes a long time for it to grow up. But Brettanomyces and Pediococcus, a type of lactic acid bacteria, are finally able to start thriving and are basically the only microbes that can now consume the range of available leftover polysaccharides, proteins. They're able to bioconvert the early weird stuff that was put out by the Enterobacter, and they're even able to subsist over some of the cellulobios, the wood grains themselves. So when we think about our mature beer or the beers that we're ready to serve, it's not until some of these longer, more fastidious microbes are able to start producing and start rounding and bioconverting all of these flavors to produce something that we're like, oh yeah, that's cool, that's enjoyable. So rewinding, going all the way back, turbid mashing is this process that we use with this raw wheat and with this, we're looking for Chris and Steve and Turbid Maltings to under-modify our malt so that there's, even in the malted barley, still a lot of protein available. It's not as dextrinous, it's not as able to be converted with the mash profile that we're using into simple sugars. So all of this is really to be able to selectively pressure our microbes to produce something that we find enjoyable. We're not controlling how our microbes are inoculating, or we're not picking and choosing which yeast and bacteria go into our beer, but through some of our decisions, we can coerce them, or at least work with them to produce something that we hope is beautiful after 1 to 3 years.
So the grain and the conversion of the grain for you is really essential to get the balance right between readily available sugars, which would feed yeasts very quickly.
Yeah.
And the proteins and structure within the grain that helps us slow down and provide a bit more nutrition, possibly for different yeasts or different to get a different style. Is that essentially what you're asking Troubadour to help with?
We're asking Troubadour to help certainly with if most brewers are going to Troubadour to malt their barley in such a way that they can mash it really simply and create their sugar-rich wort. We're asking Troubadour to help us malt it in such a way, at least the Genie barley component of it, malt it in such a way that we have to do a lot more on the mashing side to get what we want.
Right.
I mean, those are the kind of the two options to be able to get what you want out of grain, or working somewhere in between there, is have the maltster do all the work, have the brewer do all the work, or kind of work together to create what you're looking for.
Right. So it's a very different experience, a very different approach towards making beer and using grain than you would typically see from a modern beer.
Yeah, it takes a lot longer from a brewing perspective, not only on the cold side in the 3 years of making the beer instead of 2 weeks, but in the using our brewery equipment on the hot side, it takes quite a bit longer to perform a turbid mash than what we would typically consider a single infusion mash. And that's if anyone's interested in the obscurities of turbid mashing, I can go down that rabbit hole at another time for sure. But that's a deep dive in mash protocols.
Well, I would, if it's okay, I think it sounds strange to say your beers are beautiful, but the coloring and the texture are often one of the things that I notice right away about your beers compared to what you would typically have out of a bottle. Can we just take a look at some? Can you just?
Do you mind if I pour one?
Yeah, pour one. And I have no ulterior motive here. Huh? No.
This is. I am going to pour a beer that we call Back in Vogue Montmorency Cherry. So this was a beer that had aged 2 years in those neutral puncheons. We then re-fermented this on local Montmorency cherries. Half the batch was then bottled and enjoyed a year later as a beer that we released so last season, Montmorency cherry. This portion of it was aged an additional year in rye whiskey barrels, and then was allowed to bottle condition. And we have just released this beer. So let's see.
And it's at an angle. Is that intentional?
Yes, that's very astute. We condition all of our beers on their side. It's easier to have a healthy bottle re-fermentation when the yeast and the bacteria only have to work their way up vertically through the profile of a horizontal bottle, as opposed to all the way up through the bottle. And as a result, we wind up getting a lot of sediment, the lees, unlike champagne where you'll riddle and degorge a bottle, we don't do that. We keep all of the lees still in the bottle. And as a result, so not to pour that sediment out into your glass, we pour it in the same geometry that it was conditioned in. So these wine baskets or lambic baskets are what we use for pouring. And in theory, the beer just always stays in this profile. So
I just wanted to highlight, look at the gorgeous color. Cheers. And it is almost noon. So
and it's 5 o'clock somewhere, and all of those cliches are fine.
Yeah.
It's fruit.
What strikes me about this is there's so many layers to this beer.
Oh, I appreciate that.
I mean, you can tell there's the base grain. It comes through, yet you have the sweetness and sourness from the fruit. The color is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, if you were to have I can imagine this at a party, which we have done before.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about, how you actually get the flavor profiles you like? I know you talk a lot about blending, but like in this one in particular, I mean, people could drink this and say, "Is this a beer?" It would be hard pressed to say this is a beer.
I appreciate that. A lot of we start to blur the lines between low intervention and minimalist winemaking and beer making, and I think we actually find people who walk in the doors not familiar with us. When they come from the wine world or the cider world, they're more ready to engage than a lot of people who are coming from the beer world. So I appreciate that. I very much enjoy when we start to gravitate into or merge into wine flavors. In terms of what we're thinking about from a blending perspective, especially when we're going to be using fruit and a fruit that has a high degree of tannic or acid nature, is how that base beer is already structured. I'm typically looking for a beer that has lower levels of acidity, lower levels of edginess, because I know through the function of re-fermentation on the fruit, the absorption of some of those other qualities by the fruit, and then the effect of carbonic acid or the way that bubbles make your tongue feel, it's going to exacerbate or amplify some of those flavors as well. So there's this constant desire to almost undershoot your target in a lot of ways. I would rather come out with a beer that is slightly under the amount of acidity that I would like, or less intense and more drinkable than I want my final target to be, because I know through that re-fermentation, through those extra microbes that are now getting another feast and another meal, through the effect of those fruits, we're going to get there. And I think for us, acid balance, this is an inherently acidic style of beer, compared to a classic or a modern incarnation of beer. And while acid is there, I don't want that to be at the forefront. I don't want that to be necessarily the first thing you notice. We should be targeting similar acid levels as wine. People don't necessarily think of wine as sour, but when you actually measure it from titratable acidity or pH or anything like that, it's an acidic drink. Wine is a complex and well-balanced, but sour beverage. So when we're thinking about how our beers are landing, especially these fruit re-fermentations, a big part of that is looking at that balance and how acidity is a function of it, but it should not be eclipsing all the other flavors. And like you said, allowing the other components like the grain to show through. Given the opportunity, as we talked about how these microbes are voracious and want to eat everything, given the opportunity, you could have a beer that is bone dry. And while we're certainly fermenting through and to completion more than many other, more attenuated than a range of other styles, we want to leave a little something behind or find a way to create the semblance of body in a beer that is otherwise extremely fermented, just by virtue of it being 3 years with every microbe that could really attack it, given the chance, and then saying, all right, well, we'll leave there's something we can't grab.
Well, this is absolutely delicious. I think anybody who's watching this should absolutely today, like now, seek out and get one of these bottles. We do have a question, and it's actually from a grower's perspective.
Hell yeah.
Are there specific aspects of the way the grain is grown, or certain things that you're looking at from a grower that would impact whether or not a grain would be appropriate for what you do?
That's a great question, and I am sure that other growers could potentially be more well versed in being able to answer this than myself. I know that specifically the type of wheat is important, hard versus soft, as well as red versus white. I know typically we are looking for a hard wheat in terms of its ability to have richer protein and more gluten, which for our mash procedure and for what we're looking for in terms of lack of fermentability can be quite important. Typically, Antero wheat is a winter hard white wheat. I know that the main difference between the red and the white is the husk color, but also I think the red has a little bit more, can have a little bit more of a grain forward flavor to it, as opposed to the white, which might be a little more neutral in some of its flavors. So I think you could go either way with that, red versus white. Depends on what you're looking for and how you want that to balance out with your beer. I think we have so many other flavors going on in terms of the production of organic acids and other esters and phenols from our yeast. The use of aged hops, which we really didn't talk much about, but is super important in the ability of our microbes to be kind of held in check to some degree by antiseptic properties. But I think the neutrality of white wheat and the high gluten content of that hard aspect are super important for our terroir and the way that our flavor profile is, all coming together, rounded and balanced. That said, I'm always down to, to test that hypothesis and play around with. We haven't yet done any soft wheats, and I don't think we've played around with any red wheats. We've really stuck to that Antero wheat through so far every single batch of beer we've made here. I've played around with some of those others in 3-week turnaround beers, but it's harder to assess those properties at that point. So in terms of like grower conditions, I'm certainly not well versed enough to be able to say spring versus winter, and kind of the influence of climate on how those different wheats are able to be grown as well as then used by brewers afterwards. But it's a conversation I'd be excited to take part in and learn from, for sure.
Yeah, the reason for the question too is, from my perspective, is that we from the same grower, Mark Arnish Farms, we're using grains that have been through now 3 different seasons, and we're finding that we get some phenomenal flavor profiles. Like, for example, last year was a really, really dry, stressful year on the grain. Yields were down, but the Antero actually performed quite well in a very dry climate, as did the White Sonora, and we're finding some lovely flavor profiles.
That's awesome.
From a very stressed crop.
Interesting. So that's very Vintner-like. Let's stress the grapes until they're right on the edge, and then the most beautiful berries you can possibly have. That's super interesting.
Yeah. So we don't know what's going on there, but whatever they're doing, we love it. Although it's rather not have the stress, I'm sure.
Totally right for the farmers. I can tell you that seasonal or the crop of the wheat has certainly influenced not brewery efficiency necessarily, although to some degree that, but how well that wheat cooperates in the brew house. So a big part of the hot side is the lautering, or the separation of the wort from the grain in the mash, and especially using 40% adjuncts, or a huge raw component of that, and turbid mashing in general. We can get what is called a stuck mash, or basically a mash where it is difficult to allow the wort to filter through the grain bed without basically forming a layer of gumminess or beta glucan. And we definitely, as soon as we get the next year's wheat in, or because we brew seasonally, we only brew typically between November and May. We have this long hiatus before the next brew season, and that's generally when we're getting that transition of the wheat. And it's incredible to have to then recalibrate all of our tendencies towards, like, how is this wheat, how is this barley actually operating now? I can't tell if I'm getting better as a brewer, or Chris and Steve are getting better as maltsters, or the farmers are getting better, but every year it seems to be like slightly easier to use in the brew house, or maybe it's a combination of all these things, or luck, but we definitely do see kind of seasonal variability in that. So, but I can't assess the flavor as much, unfortunately, on my side.
It's a complex sequence of events. Lots of talented people involved. Lots of ingredients involved. Lots of moving parts, for sure.
Yeah. All coming together in a way that it requires communication, and that's a lot of the fun of this too. Getting to work with craft growers and craft maltsters is you have input into helping them decide what makes sense for them to grow and how they malt it and all of that. It's a conversation as opposed to just a
purchase.
Yeah, exactly. Just a customer seller kind of relationship, which is great.
Well, and on that note, and I know we're a little bit tight on time, but I do think that's something that came up from the chat as well, is talk a little bit about the ethos that you have around community and around supporting local, because that is a fundamental piece of who you are and what Primitive Beer is all about. And could you just talk a little bit about why that's important and what it brings to the table?
Yeah, I think it comes mostly from really just a personal ethos of Lisa and I. And maybe this will ruffle some feathers, but I'm a socialist. I'm operating in a market, economy and society, and I own a small business. But I believe that when we provide for each other and when we provide for those who can't provide for themselves, society is better as a function of that. So there is this huge part of supporting local that is really just, if we can start small and provide for each other and look out for each other in a small scale, and everyone is doing that, that helps at least take some of the burden off of the top-down approach, which, pisses some people off of having the larger government have to provide for everyone too. It's certainly not the only solution to it, but I tend to think society is better when you actually know your neighbors and when you are willing to engage in conversations, and whether that's done through clubs or the economy or any of that, I can't say what's better or worse, but a big part of this is really not saying that Colorado grains or fruits or businesses are better or worse than those in any other state with arbitrary boundaries and all that, but it is very much a conversation and an ethos that is dedicated towards helping those around you and collectively, rising the tide to float all ships and that type of thing. So,
absolutely. I mean, that's the thing that I will highlight here, is that the beers that you will taste from your barrels, they have touched so many people's lives, helped so many people along the way, that it is a key part of what's in the glass. And it's a huge credit to you and Lisa for this.
It's an extremely rewarding and enriching process for us. So we are, it's reciprocated every time we can get to meet new people and get to be a part of that conversation. I wouldn't want to do it any other way. This is certainly don't get into probably anything craft if you're trying to get rich or trying to I think it matters what your goals are and what brings you happiness. And the fact that I get to do this and I get to have any sort of platform is super cool.
It's fantastic. And Brandon, I thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to
pleasure's all mine.
We're kind of up on time. I think we got most of the questions and comments there. This session will, of course, be posted through the Colorado Grain Chain website, and we strongly encourage you to support local growers, local craft producers like Primitive. You can visit and order Primitive Beer through primitive.beer, so you'll get a chance to taste some of this phenomenal beer that Brandon and Lisa make. And again, just a recap and a reminder that join us in Pueblo next weekend. The Colorado Grain Chain will be doing some really, really fun and very tasty activities at the Chili Festival. And then watch for the Grain Homeschool the Grain Fields in Field School in November. And our next session for the Grain Homeschool sessions will be taking another tour around following the Antero wheat grain chain. We'll be talking about distilling single grain wheat whiskeys right here in Longmont from the Antero wheat as well. And then our goal will be to circle back, if we can, to Mark Arnish Farms, where we can actually take a look at how he and his son Brett do a lot of the growing of the Antero in ways that are just phenomenally supportive of not only the grains but also the people around. So at that note, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up and stop recording. And I think we're Brandon, thank you so much. And please say thanks to Lisa as well.
Yeah, no, you're so welcome. Thank you.